But then one day a sharp disagreement breaks out with Paul and Barnabas over Barnabas's cousin, John Mark. When Paul and Barnabas went on this first missionary journey, the church planting in Turkey, at first, cousin John Mark went with Paul and Barnabas. But early into the journey, for some reason, the Bible doesn't tell us, John Mark bugged out. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he was afraid of disease. Paul got sick. Maybe he was afraid of opposition and the crowds and the imprisonment. Maybe he was just homesick. We don't know why. The Bible doesn't tell us. All it says is that all of a sudden, John Mark left, abandoned them. So now Paul and Barnabas have to carry the ministry on their own. About a year later, they decide that they're going to go back and visit the churches. Acts 15:36. Paul says to Barnabas, let's go back and visit the brothers and sisters in every town where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take along John, who is called Mark. To which Paul responds, "You're nuts." Loose translation from the Greek, verse 38. But Paul insisted that they should not take along this man who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone on with them to the work. It's not hard to imagine how the conflict at this point would escalate. Barnabas says, Paul, give him a second chance. Paul insists, why? Because he's your cousin? Barnabas, Paul, that's not fair. I remember another guy who wanted a second chance. Remember that guy, Paul? Paul's like, that's different, Barnabas. We need somebody who won't run at first sight of angry mobs. Jesus said, whoever puts his hand to the plow and turns back is not worthy of the kingdom of heaven. It is always helpful in arguments to throw in a little Jesus. You know, that always calms things down. Paul says, past performance predicts the future. Barnabas says, really? Paul, past performance predicts the future. When was the last time you killed a Christian, Paul? Past performance predicts? Isn't that heretical, Paul? John Mark needs a chance. Give him a second chance. He's changing. I've been working on him. If we don't give him another chance, it's going to crush him. Back and forth they go. Paul could have quoted Proverbs 25, verse 19. Trusting an unreliable person in a difficult time is like a rotten tooth or a faltering foot. Barnabas could have quoted Jesus back. Jesus said, blessed are the merciful, they'll be shown mercy. Verse 39, they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed off to Cyprus. And that's the last we hear of Barnabas in the book of Acts. Verse 40 says, but Paul chose Silas and departed. After being commended by the brothers and sisters to the grace of the Lord, he traveled through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Again, we have a map there showing you the direction that Paul and Silas took, and you see Cyprus there, that island. Barnabas went there, but we don't know anything else. His story just kind of stops at that point. The band breaks up. And I'm sure it was sad. Sad, kind of like many of you were so sad when the Backstreet Boys or One Direction broke up, I suppose. But at least the gospel continued to be spread. Can you imagine Paul having to answer the questions as he went on to these churches that he had started with Barnabas? Where's Barnabas? Oh, we couldn't agree how to move forward. Well, what happened? Why couldn't you work things out? Is Barnabas ever going to come see us again? Those questions would have haunted Paul. Maybe people were wondering, I wonder if Paul's just spinning here. I wonder what the real story is. Credibility could have been undermined. What a shame that they couldn't have worked out some kind of compromise. But they didn't. The team separates, the damage is done. Now, there are lots that we can learn from this conflict with Paul and Barnabas. I'm not going to share with you exhaustively 15 steps to resolving conflict. Let me share with you some basic principles that I hope you'll keep in mind. There's some things that you can quickly think of to help give you wisdom in the midst of conflict. The first is that conflict is inevitable. Be careful. Don't overreact. Proverbs 27:17 says, iron sharpens iron, one person sharpens another. Wonderful poetry until you realize iron sharpening iron. Well, it's good that we sharpen each other, but that means violence. That means contact. That's not safe. When relationships, the only way to not have conflict in relationships is to keep your distance from each other, so you lack intimacy, you lack closeness. You don't help each other much, but you stay safe. See, even mature Christian people like Paul and Barnabas have sharp disagreements. But the key is, slow down, don't overreact. When I was in college, I was going through some stuff and got on the phone with Roseanne Russell, who was a mentor of mine, who'd been a college registrar and was very familiar with this, with everything. And Roseanne listened to me and she gave me some great wisdom I'll never forget. She said, Brett, right now, everything is accelerated and exaggerated. Everything is moving really fast and it's distorted. Don't overreact. Slow down. Be calm. How is it that we overreact? I don't know about you, but I often overreact with words. Proverbs 15, am I the only one? 15:2 says, the tongue of the wise makes knowledge attractive, but the mouth of fools blurts out foolishness. That should be the subheading of my name. Blurts out foolishness. Heard about the guy that was arguing, and he said to his friend, hey, there's always two sides to every story. And his friend blurts out, yeah, and in both sides, you're a jerk. I don't think that kind of helps very much, but we like to be able to come back with a good retort. When I was a kid, there was a book. I loved the title of this book. It says, when two or three are gathered together. The title of the book was, when two or three are gathered together, somebody spills the milk. When two or three are together, conflict is inevitable, but division is not. A gentle answer turns away anger, Proverbs 15:1 says, but a harsh word stirs up wrath. Slow down. Watch your words. Assess the problem. A wise person once said, in every situation, every conflict you need to discern, is it cold or is it cancer? If it's cold, you can basically ignore it, it'll go away, take care of itself. If it's cancer, you got to do surgery. What's our problem? What's the problem that we often have? Often the problem is we overreact to colds, we do surgery, and all of a sudden, a problem that wasn't a big problem becomes a big problem. Because you overreact with your words, your actions, your obsessiveness, your pushing. It's like sometimes you just got to let it go. Rise above. Other times there's cancer. And what's the tendency with cancer? I don't want to deal with this. Hopefully it'll just go away. But if you ignore cancer, it metastasizes. When there's conflict, it's inevitable. Be patient, don't overreact, but assess cancer or cold. Next, conflict is dangerous, so be humble. Proverbs 18 verse 19 says, an offended brother is harder to reach than a fortified city. Quarrels are like bars of a fortress. Humility means you focus on winning the friend, not winning the fight. I know everyone's like, oh, of course. But how often is it that we lose focus on the friendship because we're so focused on, I want to be understood. We have this sense of ought, like my way is right. I'm logical, they're not logical. If they were just logical like I am, and we lose the friendship because we win the battle. Remember that Greek king Pyrrhus, about 300 years before Christ, fancied himself to be the next Alexander the Great, conqueror of the world. He took his Greek armies and attacked 2 Roman cities and won both battles, but in the process lost so many soldiers. It was so costly. He created so much anger in his enemies. He was quoted as saying, if we are victorious like this in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined. And it's from him that we get the term Pyrrhic victory. You win the battle, you lose the war. You win the fight, you lose the friendship. Because, what's it say? An offended brother is harder to reach than a fortified city. Quarrels are like bars of a fortress. Oh, you've made your point. You've been understood. You've shamed the other person into submission. And you've also just created a fortress against you in the relationship. So be humble. Isn't this why Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, turn the other cheek? When somebody strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. Jesus is not saying allow yourself to be a victim of abuse. He's not saying be codependent in somebody else who's an abusive person. But he's saying sometimes the smart thing is just not to strike back. Sometimes you win the war by losing the battle. You don't always have to be understood. You don't always have to win the fight. You don't always have to prove your superiority. I realize if you're not a follower of Jesus Christ, you have a really hard time with this. He's like, I'd be a victim. No, you have to trust God to take care of you, not yourself. You want to know how lost, you know how I know this idea is rejected by the world today? Washington, D.C. We live in a world, in a city where people don't believe in turning the other cheek. Does anybody think that our political situation would be improved just a little bit if politicians could learn it's better to win the war and lose battles? When you get hit, you don't always have to hit back. Do you get hit personally? Do you really always have to hit back personally? When you get insulted, do you really have to insult back? Sometimes it's better just to turn the other cheek, be humble, and let God vindicate you. Think about the Old Testament. I love the example of Abraham and Lot. Their shepherds are fighting because their flocks have become so great. And Abraham says, Lot, let's stop the bickering and fighting between our shepherds. Tell you what, God's given us the plain. He's given us the mountainous areas. You choose which way you want to go. You take one side, I'll take the other. We'll go our separate ways and we can live in peace. Now, the wonderful thing about this is that as the patriarch, Abraham had the right to say, I'm going to take the plain. That's preferable. That's better. That's easier. But instead, he trusts himself to God. In a sense, he turns the other cheek and says, Lot, you choose what land you want. And Lot says, I'll take the plain. And he gives Abraham the harder territory. But history shows us that God prospered Abraham, and Lot ended up finding himself in Sodom, losing everything. Sometimes it's better. Always it's better to trust God to vindicate us. But see, this is where if you don't have a relationship with God, it's really hard for you to deal with conflicts well, because you can't turn the other cheek because you have to defend yourself. You have to prove yourself right. You have to be understood. And it's part of the reason there's so much conflict in the world, because people just feel like if they don't fight for themselves, nobody else is going to, and they're going to be victims. Why? Because they can't trust God, because they don't believe in God to vindicate them. But not us. It is better to lose a fight because you trust God than to lose your character and let him win the battle. By the way, this also means, so be humble. It also means take responsibility for yourself, for the relationship. Remember in Matthew 7, Jesus says, don't judge. But what he means by that is, why do you look at your the speck in your brother's eye, well, you got a log in your own eye. First, take the log out of your own eye, then you'll be able to see clearly to help your brother with a speck in their eye. What's Jesus saying? In the midst of conflict, what do we tend to do? We tend to magnify the faults of others and minimize our own responsibility. But if we're going to deal with conflict well, we have to humble ourselves and say, what's my responsibility? I'm going to focus on my responsibility. How am I at fault here? How do I need to change here? What does it mean for me to be loving, to be humble, to be kind? You deal with your own fault, and then you look at your brother, and maybe you'll be able to help, but you know what? They may not be open to you helping, but at least you've allowed God to use that to change you. One counselor has written, we should humbly assess our own contribution to the conflict and correct our own behavior and attitude before trying to point out someone else's shortcomings. Is this like foreign language in our world right now? Any marriages think you'd improve if in your next conflict, rather than pointing the finger at your spouse saying it's your fault, if you would just change, and looking at your own, some of you spouses are thinking, man, I hope my spouse is listening to this so he'll change finally, kind of thing. I'm glad that you appreciate my humor in this. The word is humble. It takes humility. It takes trust in God. Serious conflict can be resolved, but we have to work it out humbly, biblically. Sometimes it can't be resolved, and we have to conclude peacefully. This is the story of Paul and Barnabas. I wish it could have been resolved perfectly, but it wasn't. But at least it was resolved peacefully. They went their separate ways. They never badmouthed each other. You know, sometimes people in the church get upset with each other, and they'll start badmouthing the church. Sometimes people will come to New Life from other churches. And there are some good reasons to leave a church. Most reasons to leave churches are bad. But I know there's going to be trouble when somebody comes and immediately they start bad-mouthing people in the other church, bad-mouthing the leadership of the other church, because I know it's just going to be a matter of time before they're bad-mouthing here. Sometimes we may disagree and separate, but we need to go not in anger, but in honor. If possible, Romans 12:18 says, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody. That means we need to be gracious as well. We need to be ready to forgive. That's the story of Paul. 2 Timothy chapter 4 is so healing because this is the last letter that Paul will ever write. And among his last words, he writes to Timothy, do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he has loved this world, has deserted me. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in ministry. It's probably been about 10 years since Paul and Barnabas went their separate ways over a conflict because of John Mark. And now Paul is at the end of his life, and there are three people he wants to be close to. Luke is with him. He wants Timothy to come, and he wants Timothy to bring with him. Of all of the people he could have asked for, he asks for John Mark. He's useful.